When I first started to learn to trail, there are a few aspects of it, or well, more than a few aspects of it, that had me confused. You know, was there a system? How could you actually stay in contact with an animal? What did you do if you lose the tracks? And what I want to do really is explain briefly how we go about thinking about following a trail, and how we deal with that trail when it disappears. And I think this is an important aspect to get hold of as a tracker, because when you're new to it, and that's really what this presentation is designed for, you know, for people that haven't necessarily done a lot of trailing, you're never quite sure whether it's just a hard trail or something strange has happened to that trail, or the animal is doing something strange, or whether you're just not a very good tracker. And there are certain things that you can do, I think, that can give you a lot more confidence when it comes to how to approach losing and finding that trail. In fact, I often say to my students that you can think of trailing as just a continuation of finding and losing that trail again. And sometimes you'll find that trail in a few seconds, sometimes it might take you an hour to find it when you're really looking for it. So really don't be too upset with yourself if you feel like you're struggling and constantly losing and finding it. Certain substrates lend themselves to that anyway, and it's very, very normal for you to be in that position. If we think about how we approach trailing there are three aspects, and these aren't my concepts, these are concepts that have been shared with me with my cyber tracker colleagues since I really started seriously along this route. But we can divide trailing up into three aspects, if you like. One is what we would call systematic trailing, and that's where we can stay in touch with the actual tracks of that animal more or less constantly. That doesn't mean we find every single track, but we look along the trail and we can see enough that we're convinced that it connects back to where we were. Now obviously the more experienced you are, then the less of these tracks you really need to see before you find fairly happy that that is your animal. The other aspect is this predictive tracking, and we would think about predictive tracking as, in this scenario, and the scenario that I'm going to share today is which way round, or which side of that tree did the animal go, as it turned left, as it turned right. So you're constantly scanning ahead on the landscape to try and guess where the most likely route that animal took, and I would describe that as predictive. And then finally the other aspect of it is speculative tracking, and you can start this even before you leave your house, and that is, where are these animals now? So where are they on the landscape at this particular time of year, in these weather conditions, in this season? And that will vary a little bit, and all of that speculative stuff is going to be very different depending on where you are in the world. Animals are going to behave differently here where I live to where you live, I'm sure. But constantly, as we're following the trail, we're trying to think, where are these animals going, and we're trying to look for tracks potentially that are going to substantiate that theory. So another expression we can use is that we have an idea of what the animal's doing and where it's going, and we then use the tracks to prove that. So this is going back to this basis of science and tracking being quite linked. So we think the animal's gone that way, we go and look for the evidence that proves it. And if, when we get to the spot where we think we'll find that evidence and we don't, we have to come back and think again, and then come up with another idea of where they've gone. And this is where it becomes a bit more intuitive and I guess a little bit more of an art form than a science. So what I suggest you do if you're new to tracking is try and find the biggest ungulate, hoofed animal in your region. Particularly in Europe, where our big ungulates tend to move in herds, they'll cut the ground a lot with their hooves to start with, and if there's a lot of them cutting the ground, it makes life so much more simple for you to follow and pick up that sign. Soft-footed animals are really quite tricky in most situations, and probably would be better left till you've got a little bit more experience. And I say the biggest ungulate because in Europe obviously we've got lots of roe deer. They can be trailed, they can also be really quite difficult to trail, particularly if you're new to it. Where I am, in my part of the world, we've got fallow deer, and they're great to follow. What I have in my part of the world is an overabundance of fallow deer, so they're actually really quite difficult sometimes to be sure that you're on the same animal. The densities are so high, it's very easy, if you're not careful, to jump onto the trail of an animal that you're not actually started on, or you haven't actually started on. The other thing we can start to think about is when to go trailing, and we need to give ourselves the best chance. We've just experienced a whole load of storms in the UK and most of Europe. They're settling now. It's a little bit blustery still. The blustery weather can help. It can also hinder. If there's a good strong breeze, then obviously any noise that we make can be partially hidden, at least, from the animals that we're trailing, because remember, tracking is about seeing animals, not just about finding all the tracks. But when it's very blustery and gusty and swirling around, in my experience, the animals get a bit unsettled, and they're constantly on the lookout and very seldom relaxed. If you could ever say a deer is ever completely relaxed, I'm not sure they ever are. But that can, depending on the strength of the wind, help or hinder. It's also a good idea to go after heavy rain. And what heavy rain does is it tends to wipe out all the old trails, and when you hit a fresh trail, it should be fairly obvious. And also you can think about the time of year with that regard. Where I live in an area that's predominantly deciduous forests, early to late autumn is a great time to go. All the leaves are starting to fall down. They've started to obliterate all the old trails and tracks, and they become quite deep. Or the trails become quite deep, the tracks become quite deep, because there's a good lot of leaf litter in there to make a track. As the year progresses, all of that leaf litter gets rotted down, recycled by the fungi and by the insects and what have you, and you've quite thin substrates. And substrate is very dependent on, or will be very dependent on your success rate. And there are some substrates that are very, very difficult to trail over, and there are some substrates that I would suggest it's impossible to trail over. So something else to remember, again, which again might hopefully will give you some confidence. And it echoes what Preston Taylor says in his latest book, Tracking the American Black Bear, which is a superb read if you haven't got hold of it yet. Is there is a bit of a myth that a master tracker can follow any animal across any substrate, and that's really not true, or at least not in my experience. So again, don't beat yourself up if you can't follow a cat across a forest full of leaf litter. It's probably not possible. It might be if it snows. Again, this is about the substrate being dependent on your success. And some trails with that regard, I would suggest, are just not worth following. But that's hard to, obviously, as you're a beginner, or if you are a beginner, it's hard to assess that, because you never know whether it's just not possible for anybody to follow this trail, or whether you're just not very good at it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look for our biggest set of ungulates if we're new to this. We're going to think about when we're going to pick our day, so we've got the best success of being able to see those, or the best chance of successfully being able to see those tracks, should I say. And that would be potentially linked with the time of year. And we can also think about the weather conditions, not just from the point of view of the track and track aging and all of that sort of important stuff, but just whether you're going to be able to get near the animals. If it's absolutely still, completely still day, and the ground's dry with crunchy leaf litter, it's like walking across cornflakes. You're perhaps not going to get near the animals, even if you're trailing them well. So places to look for animal trails. When we first start, certainly in the woodlands I operate in, and British woodlands generally, they're quite compartmentalised. Even if they're quite big forests, they often have roads going through them, extraction racks. Sometimes these denote ownership boundaries, but generally the little parcels of woodland within a bigger woodland are often blocked off by a good system of rides. And I'm standing on one at the moment. You can probably see it over my shoulder. This is typical of an extraction route that's gone down. There's been some planting behind me and some extraction. And deer, and we are going to focus on deer because they're the easiest thing to start learning on. As I say, the bigger the better. They tend to cross out on these rides. They'll sometimes wander along, feeding along them. Sometimes they're just travel routes, go straight across them. And if we can find a route that starts on a ride, we have two advantages often. One is that there's nearly always, or very frequently, there's good substrate, there's mud on the ride, so you can get a good idea of whether you've got the right age. And the other thing is if they show you if they're going somewhere purposefully, if that makes any sense, in that we may find an exit from one block of woodland and we may find an entry on the other side to another block of woodland, which suggests these animals are going across. They're not meandering and they're not browsing, and following a trail that's purposefully made, the deer actually going somewhere, they're not meandering around feeding so much, is probably going to be one that will make life easier for you, certainly as a beginner. So we found exactly that kind of scenario where we've got an obvious travel route coming through here, and on this side of the trail, or the track that I'm on, the extraction track, it's very muddy, so you can see that it's chopped up, and this gives us a perfect opportunity to gauge the age of this trail. And then if we follow across this ride or this extraction route, we also find deer tracks in the leaf litter, and these are a little bit harder to see because they are in the leaf litter, but there are several tracks coming all the way through. So it looks like at least one animal has come across the ride and potentially gone through, and the trail is carrying on in that direction. So the temptation here now is to see that we've got a trail. We may judge this as fresh, and I aren't going to talk too much about aging because there is a presentation specifically on track aging, but obviously that's quite important. In fact, it's very important. We don't follow tracks that aren't fresh enough to give us a chance to catch up with the animal, unless we're just practicing. Sometimes that does have value, sometimes it doesn't. But just as while we are talking about aging, there's a couple of points I would ask you to think about. One is that, the way I consider these things anyway, aging is not just about time. Aging can be about what happens to the trail. So what I mean is if you have an event, then that track just ages quickly to the point where it will disappear. And we find this a lot in Britain, certainly. We have a lot of plantations of beech and hornbeam and oak, and the leaf litter on a dry day, and it will dry all the way down to the ground, so even when that gets turned over you don't always get the colour contrast, which is one of the things we're looking for when we're aging. And I've followed trails in beech leaves that have been really obvious, and the winds come through and they just disappear in front of your eyes, and when you are finding them, you're just finding them very sporadically, in deep places, in places where they will hold track traps, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. But that trail is, perhaps an hour old, and suddenly it's gone. So it's not just about time. What we're also going to do before we go charging out onto this is we're going to do what Nate Harvey, who's taught me an awful lot about tracking, describes as taking a little inventory, and this again can help build your confidence. So before we go charging off, we tend to, or I do anyway, I tend to look at these areas and try and assess what's happened. At this point we can get an idea of how many animals, how many trails are going in there, are they all the same age. Sometimes you can tell the sex of the animals and the composition, whether it's young and their mothers or just bucks on their own, and all of that can help you later on down the trail, particularly if it gets difficult and you're not sure you're on it. And also it takes the element of surprise away. So what I found a lot with students is if they don't do this and they go charging off and trails come in from the sides, they assume that they've got it wrong to start with, and it really knocks their confidence. Whereas if you do this little inventory and we notice that there are trails coming in of the same age, it can very well mean that the animals are all travelling together. And if you're thinking about that and you knew that right from the beginning there was an animal travelling parallel to you on the left and it suddenly cuts in and follows your trail, it's not a surprise, it doesn't knock your confidence. And with that in mind, if you ever get a chance, just watch deer, because they move through landscapes great distances apart sometimes, and you can be on a trail and there can be parallel trails going either side and you're not necessarily aware of it. And from the great situation that I'm in is because I teach tracking, and sometimes I'll put 4 or 5 trackers on different trails and you can watch them weave in and out of each other as these animals in the same group cross and join, and then they all go along the same trail and then they'll split again. And it's quite fascinating. If you see animals from the side when they're going across, it's very difficult to judge the depth of the animal, if you like. So there might be an animal here that you can see, and there might be another one 30 feet away, but it looks like it's just behind it, or just walking side by side with it, should I say. If you can get behind it, you can often see they're often a long way apart. So bear all of that in mind. And also I would do this inventory in any area of confusion. So if you come into a feeding area, come into a bedding area, it's worth just taking a little circuit around that area and finding out what's gone on. Sometimes you can see the trail going straight across an area of confusion and it's not an issue, you can just follow it out. Sometimes, especially if your group has bedded, and often where I am in the UK, because the density of deer is so high, they'll walk straight across a bedding area that may be very close in age and may be very difficult for you to separate. So in that regard, it's often worth having a good look around to see whether your animals have indeed gone right across, or whether it's actually those that stopped. So I'm standing on the trail now. It's behind me. I'm looking back up it against the direction of travel, so animals have come here. Some of these first bits that are where I'm showing you principles, these trails may not be fresh. They may not be as fresh as you'd like. It's just as long as I can see them, and the camera can see them, more importantly, we'll talk about them. My plan is to then jump on a fresh trail so you can see how I would follow an animal, and my thought process as I'm doing that. So this comes across the ride from where we've just been. This is the obvious sort of travel route. And it's important when you're looking at travel routes to make sure there are fresh tracks on them, because anybody can follow these well-worn paths, and it doesn't mean there's an animal there. So you need to know when there are fresh tracks on it, and equally know when there aren't and the animal's jumped off, because they don't stay on these forever. And this is where tracking can get more tricky for people, because they they assume that if they just walk on this road they're going to be tracking animals, so that's the thought process, and that's not the case. You've got to make sure there are fresh tracks. So this splits now, this trail splits, and there's a trail going off to my right if I was facing that way, and off to the left if I was facing that way, so your right and your left rather. So for me as a tracker, I need to obviously assess which way those animals have gone. And this is just talking a little bit now about how to work a trail. So I'm going to come back up towards the camera and just and talk effectively with my back to you, so you can see how I would follow this. So one of the principles that I'm going to introduce to you or talk to you about is that we need to be looking as far ahead as we can to see the actual tracks. And in some situations, that can be several hundred meters. If you think about a frosty, low-cut field of grass, you might be able to see the fresh trail and connect it all the way up, all the way across that field to where it exits, maybe where it goes out the field. In other situations, in dark forests where the light's really poor, you may only be able to see a metre or so in front of you, and not even that. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify the most, or the furthest visible track that we're happy is part of our trail. So this is the systematic bit. We need to connect this back. We don't need to follow every single trail or find every single track, sorry. In fact, if you try and do that, you'll probably never catch up with the animal. That can be valuable when you're learning to look for difficult or working on difficult substrates, because there is a point on any trail where it's going to get hard. It's just inevitable. So if you're used to looking for tracks in hard spots, then that's always going to help you. But generally speaking, our systematic bit is furthest visible track that we can see, make sure it connects back, and then we walk to it. And when we walk, as soon as we start walking to it, we take our eye off that and we're looking for the next one. So we're constantly trying to look for the next visible sign, as it were. So we know, put it another way, if we know there's a deer track there, there's no point me staring at it and then looking for the next one. It's not going to move. What I can do is I can walk towards this, and if I've got any doubt whatsoever, I can give it a quick glance and go, yeah, that's the track, and then I'm looking for the next one. And then I can start to be a little bit more predictive. So I can think, has it gone down that route? Has it gone down that route? And all the time we're doing this, we're keeping our head up so we can see these possibilities. So one, we can see the possibility of seeing the animal. One, we can see the possibility of where the next likely route is, so predict it. And this can be quite a way in the distance. Now in a moment we'll bring the camera around and I'll illustrate this in slightly more detail. What we're trying to avoid doing is keeping our head down so that we can't see the next track, we can't see the possible exit, so we can't predict it, and more importantly we can't see the animal. So the very first evaluation I did, I followed a group of about 5 deer into an area. We think in the end they bedded. I started looking for them, and I was in that regard the only person that day that didn't see the animals. They all spooked, they all ran off, And Brian McConnell, who was assessing me, I remember him saying, "Did you see all those animals, John?" And I went, "What animals?" So it's this aspect of, not only are you going to see the best route these animals took, you're also more likely to see them themselves. This trail now, I've come beyond the split, the one we were just talking about a moment ago, and from looking ahead and way back up there when we did that first little intro to this particular trail, as long as you're looking ahead, as we are emphasising, and we can't emphasise enough how looking ahead and looking at the landscape is important. I noticed from way back there that this trail goes across the stream, and you can see that from way back there. And also the second trail goes around the sides, which you may not be able to see yet, and also crosses the trail, and from here I can see that those travel routes at least join up. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that there are fresh tracks on those, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there are two sets of animals, but it could well be the case, because they'll often travel in groups like this. So be aware that the further ahead you look, and sometimes you can just see the obvious route at least, so you can do the predictive stuff way in the distance, and then our role then is to think, well, I think they've gone that way. We find the evidence to prove it. We go and look for tracks in the place we think that's where they went, and if we're wrong, we come back and think again. I've come a bit further along this trail that we crossed the stream on, just to where it gets a little bit harder to find, just to talk through the principles of what we do when we're struggling to find it. So I have a good track here, and I have a couple more in front, and then after that it gets a little bit trickier to see. I can actually see them, I think, but just for the purposes of the presentation, I'll just explain how we would approach finding this trail again once we'd lost it. So the key thing is if you're not seeing tracks, is to stop. Don't keep walking backwards and forwards, hoping that you're going to find them. Certainly not when you're new to this. There are slightly more, I guess, advanced techniques we can talk about in a moment where you can do this. So if this is my last track here, I will anchor this in my mind, or I might even put a stick next to it. Depends how good you are at orientating yourself on the landscape, and you'll get a lot better at this the more you trail, to be honest. In my early days, I used to often end up following deer trails and get to the end of them, or decide to go home and not know where the hell I was. I used to carry a little GPS in the end, but I'm a lot better now at guessing where I am. So this is my last known track, and I don't see anything in front of me, or at least pretend I don't see anything in front of me. I can actually see tracks up there. So what I would do is take a little step back to start with, and then just without moving, so just with my eyes, I look down the possible routes, and there isn't really a likely route here, because there's a bush in the way. There's a possibility it goes left, there's a possibility it goes right, there's a possibility it goes through there, right hand side of this tree, left hand side of this tree. So what I do is I scan along that route just to have a double check, as it were, and if I can't find them, and I will make this a little bit of a judgment, I choose a route that I think is the most likely. And in this scenario, this animal has been coming in a straight line pretty much all the way around here, so making an abrupt left or right is least likely, I would suggest. So my first thought is that I'll just walk forward a little bit. So from my last track, I will take a step forward and look again, and these tracks that I thought were tracks are in fact where the animal went. If that didn't work though, I might come back and walk this route. Just a couple of steps and have a look, and then walk that one, and so on. And if the substrate doesn't change significantly, then you've got to be fairly sort of confident in that that you will see it if it's actually walked that way. I'll explain that a little bit better in that if we've got deep leaf litter here and deep leaf litter there, and you don't see tracks in it, but you're seeing them here, then it's probably not because you're not very good at seeing tracks, it's probably because it didn't walk that way. So how far you walk along these routes is a little bit variable. If that didn't work, I might walk another couple of meters along the same routes, just a little bit further out. And again, if the substrate hasn't changed, then I'd start to suspect I've missed it completely. And there's a couple of things that can happen there, and all of them have happened to all of us at some point as trackers. One is that this last good track wasn't a good track, and you actually should go back to your best good track before that, as it were. So all the way through the trail, as I remember to say this, we need to be marking where we were happy. So you've got to think, where is your happy place? Are you definitely sure you were on the animal? And if this proves not to be connected to anything around here in the same substrate, then you start to think maybe this isn't a good track after all. The other thing that can happen is that they can turn round. We always think as trackers that these animals are just going ahead of us and they're never going to change and they're just going to straight line walking and they're not doing anything else. And of course they're living creatures, they can do exactly what they want. So a story again on an evaluation when Nate Harvey was evaluating me. I followed a group of 5 deer up to the top of a brow where they'd clear felled a lot of timber and the trails completely disappeared, and I spent I think an hour on the top of this little plateau looking at every possible route to see whether they'd gone out that way, and couldn't find a track at all. And after about that amount of time I said to Nate, the only fresh tracks I can find are the one are going down in the opposite direction. And he said, what does that tell you? And of course they'd gone up to the top, mooched around a bit and come straight back down again, and I'd seen those tracks going up. So another thing we're doing when we're tracking is we're noting all of this. We're thinking, is there a trail crossing? Do these tracks face the other direction? Because it could be a completely different group of animals, but of course it could be your animals that have decided to come back on themselves. If this doesn't work, then we start to go a lot further out, and I tend to go, or what you should think about tending to do is go to areas where you will definitely see tracks if the animal stands on them. And this brings us to track plates, or track traps as they're called. So we look along these possible routes of travel and we go somewhere where we're confident that if the animal stood there we would spot it as trackers. And how far out you go from this last known track is very dependent in that scenario on the track plates. Obviously if you go way out, so you need to do this systematically, if you go way out you could well be jumping onto a different trail because there's no connection. If we're good at this and we're systematic, then we can build confidence again. And I say that because if we find that we've worked this area in a way I'm going to describe in a moment very thoroughly, and we only find one set of fresh tracks, or at least tracks that are the same age in your mind as the ones you followed in, you've got to ask yourself 2 questions. One is, if that isn't my animal, where the hell did my animal go? And the other thing is, if it isn't my animal, where the hell did it come from? And if you've been really thorough and you've worked it, you can be much more confident that that is your group or your animal. So what I would do in that scenario is I would come out and start to sweep in a little arc. So we work in these travel routes, which are often called working the spokes, and the hub of the wheel where the spokes are attached is this last known track where you're really happy. And we can start to work an arc, and depending on where the track traps are on the substrate, sometimes you can work a little arc. Sometimes also when there's no obvious travel route, which there is here, working an arc is more efficient than working a spoke. And if I just come beyond that track a little bit and work this little arc looking for tracks, and I'm looking in track traps, then I've got a really short circumference, if you like, to cover. If I go way over there, I've got to cover a massive area to make sure I'm cutting the trail. It could be that all I need to do is get onto a decent substrate and walk around it, checking for tracks. And indeed I can pick the trail up here again, so I could see it there to be fair, but I can also see it here, and I'm looking at it in a place where the leaf litter is quite deep, so it's a track trap, and I know I'm going to see it if it's there. And have confidence in that as well. I've had so many students where they're pointing out, looking in track traps, and they're showing me muntjac tracks and blackbird tracks, and they're still convinced that the reason they're not seeing fallow deer tracks is because they're not very good at it. Whereas obviously if you can see a muntjac track and a blackbird track, you're going to see a fallow deer track. We've hit a reasonably clear section of the trail here, so I just wanted to talk about moving along the trail. What we tend to do is stay on the trail, so we stand on it. This gives us a better idea of where the animal's likely to go. We can sort of see it from their perspective. Every now and then you might want to just squat down and look at the possible exits from the height of whatever you're following, so fallow deer head. And we move, generally we move quick enough that we can see the tracks ahead of us, and as I said earlier, sometimes you can see them for hundreds of metres, sometimes it's only a couple of metres. And what we're trying to avoid is just keep stopping and starting and stopping and starting. And this is what happens generally when you just see one track and then jump to the next one and jump to the next one, instead of forgetting about the first track you saw and then just looking for the next one. And if you're close to an animal, obviously you're going to slow all of this up. If you're not close to an animal and you're somewhere exposed, it can be more beneficial for you to get off that trail or move quickly on it. And when I say get off it, is that if you can see it quite clearly, one of the principles we have when we're tracking is that at some point we generally come off the trail and start to hunt or look for the animal. So if the cover isn't right, but we're fairly confident that the fresh tracks are going this way, we can use cover, we can approach in a different way, and hopefully then pick up that trail and keep checking in on that trail just to make sure that we're okay. So we can move fairly quickly across the trail sometimes that's just not really appropriate, and sometimes, most of the time, we will be on the trail following it, so we can follow exactly where the animal went. But sometimes if an approach is imminent, then we will get off of that trail and maybe just keep popping in and out if that's going to make us or give us a better chance of being successful. So just to reiterate what we're doing, I see a track, I take my eye off it, I look for the next one, see it, take my eye off it, look for the next one, and every now and then I'm just checking in to make sure that these are fresh deer tracks. Our group has converged with the other trail, which I think was running parallel to us right from where we jumped over the stream, and there are a couple of trails now that have come across another ride and into something that I hope we'll be able to see. So I'm just going to walk this trail and kind of try and verbalise what my thought process is when I'm trailing it, and hopefully that will help. So most of what I can see along this trail is the discoloration of the leaf litter being turned over. I can see a whole bunch of tracks in there, multiple animals, certainly more than one, and I can also see them further up. So I'm working my way along this trail, looking at the furthest possible sign. I'm also looking to the left and right in case something drops off, particularly over by the stream area, because there could be evidence of trails going up there. But so far this looks like it's just coming along quite normally all the way through here. I've got a really good track trap here which confirms that nothing has jumped off really. The bulk of the traffic has gone through here, and I can see this a long way away into the distance. And it could be that if I thought this was particularly fresh, super fresh, then I would start to stop more regularly, move very close, slowly. I'd probably cover my hands and my face, and I'd start to use binoculars a lot more. What we can find though, if we can, and this whole area here is a track trap because of the depth and of the leaf litter and the moisture underneath it. But what we can think about is, if it does get thin, is to look for those areas. I know we talked about systematically walking to them and finding them, but frequently you can have a big gap of 20 or 30 feet and then see the tracks further over in a track trap. So what I always say to people is, trackers don't have better eyesight than anybody else, they just look in the right places. So I'm walking this trail, it's all fairly straightforward. It's coming along through here, and I can see the obvious travel route, and that's the one they're taking. So I hope that makes sense. Just to reiterate, if you're learning, find the biggest ungulate in your area, pick the days when you go out so you're most likely to see the trails. Think about the wind as well, which we haven't talked about because there hasn't been a lot of time, but do think about how your impact on the environment is going to be and the way you approach the wind. And ideally you want to be walking into the wind, obviously, and or a crossing trail could be, or crossing wind could also be advantageous. Don't panic if you lose the trail, it's just part of tracking. You'll lose it all the time, we all do constantly, but be systematic about trying to find it again, so that you can be very happy that when you do find it, those are most likely to be your animals. Sometimes, and I have this problem a lot because of the density of deer I have here, sometimes you're not 100% sure whether that's your animal or another group that came through 20 minutes later, because in these environments oftentimes tracks can look very fresh for a long time, and certainly 20 minutes is nothing in the life of a track. certainly in stable weather conditions.